This is unit number 4 in our Introduction to Ethics, where we'll be studying Aristotle and his view of virtue ethics. Well, I'll turn our attention to the overall objectives of this particular unit in terms of Aristotle's ethics. By way of background, we'll do two things. First, just a few brief comments about the different ways Aristotle's ethics has been interpreted, simply to give us a background to the difference of opinion, and realise that you're going to hear a difference in various books that you read, articles that you read, in interpreting Aristotle's ethics. It would be inappropriate in this particular context, not just in the study of Aristotle's ethics, but bringing Aristotle up without pausing for a moment and talking about the importance and the place of Aristotle. So we'll do that very briefly also. Then we'll turn our attention to his value theory and in particular his ethics. And to do that, we're going to look briefly at his good life, justice and virtue, morality and ethics, and connect it very, very briefly to his political views, and very briefly. Then we'll make some summary observations, try and bring this unit together for you into a summation of his actual ethics. And then I'd like to spend a short while evaluating his virtue ethics, just their value, because you're going to have people talk about virtue ethics having advantages and disadvantages, strengths and weaknesses, and I think it's appropriate you get some additional comment from me on that as well. And lastly, and of course significantly, of course, is perspective, what you need to know. So that's where we're going. So let's turn our attention first and foremost to the interpretations of Aristotle. Just take one authoritative illustration from the International Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Sachs, for example, asserts that the somewhat traditional view of Aristotle's ethics is that he taught that you have habits, if you like, moral decision-making habits, and that the good life is a mindless following of those routines. He thinks this comes from some wrong translations of the word hexis, or virtue. He wants to assert that it's the stable equilibrium of the soul that was the heart of Aristotle's ethics. You'll see, if you turn to the textbook, for example, that Schaeffer-Ladau really have the concept of a life of wise choices that are worthy pursuits. Really, that's an indication of different views. Some would assert that his view of ethics is a manifestation of the golden rule in Christ's teaching in the New Testament, and you should understand Aristotle as being a kind of secular reflection of the golden rule. Do unto others as you have them do to you. Well, that's just to give you an indication. When you're reading the various articles, realize you may get some different interpretations of his ethics, and it may confuse you. As I mentioned earlier, we can't pass by any discussion of Aristotle without first recognizing that in so many ways he is the philosopher. As great as Plato is, or I should say was, the volume of material that Aristotle produced in a relatively short period of time, 12 to 13 years. Once the Lyceum was established, he was teaching there and he began publishing. He did all of this in about 10 years, 12 years, staggering. He made lasting contributions in the area of natural science, mathematics, logic, political theory, ethics, of course, as we're looking at politics. Indeed, said that his political views shaped the views of people like many of the liberal scholars of the background to our own constitution, John Locke, for example. And of course, enormous contribution in philosophy, especially in the area of epistemology. George Frederick Hegel said, and I think it is worth reading his comment, he penetrated into the whole universe of things and subjected its sacred wealth to intelligence, and to him the greater number of the philosophical sciences owe their origin and distinction. In the Encyclopaedia Britannica, there's a similar kind of praise. Aristotle was the first genuine scientist in history. That's pretty astonishing. Well, we don't have the time in this course to spend a lot of time talking about the background because we're focusing on ethics rather than philosophy proper, but truly a remarkable man, and some enormous contributions that he made. And again, I'd remind you of this time period. This is all taking place. It's interesting when you look at this little summary of what's going on. If you look at the left-hand column, the Greek world, really it's an amazing period of conflict. You have the end of the Peloponnesian Wars, with the death of Socrates and Plato. Then you have the rise of the tyrannies in Athens, and then you have the restoration of democracy, and you have the war in Asia Minor, and you have the Persian awakening, the war with Sparta, and then eventually Philip of Macedon taking over, and eventually Philip, who passes everything on to his son, Alexander, who eventually becomes known as Alexander the Great, who, as a student of Aristotle, supported him, so that when Alexander basically was master of all of Greece and the Greek world, he essentially became the patron of Aristotle, and the establishment of the Lyceum in Athens. And it's not surprising that his patronage enabled Aristotle to do things on a scale that Plato could never have envisaged. Of course, after the fall of Alexander and the decline of the Macedonian powers, poor Aristotle was unceremoniously kicked out of Athens, and his great work effectively came to an end. But still, in that 11, 12, 13-year period, he still produced an enormous amount of work and a great scholarly contribution. Well, let's turn our attention now to looking at his value theory in ethics. Aristotle wants to engage in this discussion of value and of ethics to establish what life is about, what the good life is, what a happy life is. And he wants to do that in terms of purpose. Now, in a moment I'm going to talk about telos and purpose, but for the moment let's just go with a very simple summation. What is life about? And he rejects Plato's view that justice is the key concern for the context of life. And he rejects also Plato's idea that justice is an abstract concept. Rather, he focuses on happiness. We'll talk about the meaning of that word in a moment. But that happiness be found in the context of living a virtuous life. And what is distinctive about Aristotle is that virtuous life begins with a family. It begins with a family and then moves out to the village and then to the city-state. In other words, there is a priority of the family and of the individual. It's a very liberal idea, one which was very attractive to people like John Locke. And for Aristotle, this happiness must not be an abstract concept like Plato. And it can't be a mere fleeting physical experience in the present time. It's got to be something bigger than that. But it's also got to be practical. And what's more, it's got to be something that fits the whole of one's life. In other words, I want to live a happy life, not be happy here and sad happy. A happy life. And this happiness has to be unique to humans because we are a unique species. And it's in that context that we begin to go deeper into this word happiness, at least just for a moment. Telos. A happy life is one that has purpose. It's the Greek word telos is an interesting word. It's used in a number of different philosophies in the Greek philosophers. It means direction or purpose or end. We get telescope and telemetry from the word. And Aristotle saw telos at work in every area of life. He saw it work in the cosmos. He saw it work in human relations, in human life. It was always a purpose. And perhaps a simple illustration is you're born, you live, you get married, you have family, you grow old and die. There is a definite purpose, and we will follow it. I mean, you're on a trajectory, or telos, like that right now, wherever you are. And his ethics is an attempt to explain how it all works out. And so the word he uses for happiness is eudaimonia. It's a Greek word, and it's been a problematic word when it's translated into English, because the word does not mean I'm feeling happy. It's happiness. It's much more a state of being. But it's more than a subjective state of mind. For example, it's a hot day, I'll have a cool drink, maybe an adult beverage, it may be a Coke, and I'm sitting around with friends and I'm feeling good and I'm feeling happy. No. Eudaimonia means much more than that. It's a much bigger total package. It's something that can't be gained or lost in a few moments, like pleasurable sensations. He has a rather famous saying in his Nicomachean Ethics. His ethics was named after his son. For as it is not one swallow or one fine day that makes a spring, so it's not one day or one short time that makes man blessed and happy. So if we have this wider concept, we understand why he wanted to illustrate that and drive it home to us by having a discussion about a child, an amazing discussion. He says, can a child be happy? Now, I have children, and I can assure you the time when they are excited and clearly happy. Well, that's not what he's talking about happy, is he? He's talking about eudaimonia. He's talking about something greater than that. And the problem, he says, for a child is they haven't lived long enough to experience enough of life to know what happiness is and to know what the direction of their life is. And he goes on to say that you can't just be driven by desires because you've got all kinds of wants. You have acquired desires. And he says, you acquire a taste for this or a desire for that. And he said, that's just the apparent thing that comes into life. You acquired it. But there are things far deeper. There are natural desires for the individual. Some people like the luxury of caviar, for example, that wonderful Russian/French food. He says food, not caviar, is the heart of what we should be desiring. And that's a really good thing to have. You have to have food. You have to have water to drink, whether you want it or not. In other words, you really can be happy eating your mother's green peas or porridge. With this consideration in mind, Aristotle comes up with a definition of the good life. And it's an interesting one, and it helps us understand what he means when he says a child can't be happy. He says, the good life consists in the possession over the course of one's lifetime of all those things that are really good for us. In other words, good choices, things we've acquired, and it can't be decided until we're old, if you like, at the point of death. On our deathbed, looking back, we can say, yes, by George, this was a happy life. This was a good life. And it's with that in mind that he wants to develop the concept of virtue. And virtue becomes the thing that moves us along that pathway. He says the thing that guides us between the good life on the one hand and actually living the good life on the other. In other words, knowing about what's good and making it and then actually living it. He says it's actually moral character. And moral character or virtue is essential. And that entails developing over a period of a lifetime good habits and sober choices. And he calls these habits or virtues or excellencies. And he distinguishes between two virtues. Obviously, if you've got to know what's good, that's an intellectual virtue. But if you're actually regularly disposed to choose the good, that's a moral virtue. So in other words, his distinction between knowing what is good and doing what is good. And in that regard, Aristotle has an idea about how we achieve this. And he says, first and foremost, we have to realize that this ability to choose between, to move from intellectual virtues to moral virtues, to live from what we know is the good life to actually living the good life, that's something that has to be learned. And the second thing he notes is that if we regulate our desires too much, in other words, we're too rational or too little irrational, then we create problems. And he sees the need for what he's going to discuss as the moral mean, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. He sees it as important to have a balanced development of working between the intellectual virtues, where we know what is the good life, and actually living the good life. Is the mean to get there is walking down this moral mean. He argues that these desire-regulating virtues that enable us to walk down this moral mean, to move from merely knowing what is the good life and actually achieving the good life, these are actually character traits. Virtuous is what makes us a virtuous person. And so that brings us back for a moment to pause and come back to happiness. Happiness is thus characterized by living out a balance between moral character traits, because we're moving on a pathway. And in that process, he says, humans are unique. We are able to find happiness in the satisfaction that we're walking down that path road. So there's happiness as the totality of life. There's happiness of moving down that pathway because we have the ability to balance our rational life and the irrational life in such a way as we're experiencing happiness. And we can think about it. And that makes us very different. In other words, we know when we're happy and we know when we're not. Now for Plato, individual happiness was not a big concern at all. In fact, it's probably fair to say that as far as Plato was concerned, the only person who could really be happy was a philosopher, king or queen, who was spending all the day doing philosophy, because that's the only possible way you could really have a good life and the only possible way that you could experience the fullness of life. But he wasn't concerned about that. He was concerned about justice. And hence, as far as the people who were enjoying philosophy, this wonderful thing, he was happy to remove from them all kinds of things. That takes you back to our previous discussion of Plato. Whereas that utopian idea, Aristotle rejects. He's more focused on the individual and the individual development of moral virtue, the ability to walk down the moral mean. And it's worthy of noting at this point that while both philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, see human beings as political creatures, essentially community creatures, we have to live in community, Aristotle places a very high value on the individual, at least in terms of the man and running his family, whereas Plato, it's the city-state, and that's the context. A huge difference. Well, the moral mean. We're walking between the intellectual virtue of knowing what is the good life and the moral virtue of actually beginning to walk down the pathway of actually achieving it. And here we have a picture of it. I think the diagram on the right-hand side of the screen is perhaps the most helpful to you. It's a life lived between excess and deficiency. Perhaps you've heard of expressions like everything in moderation. That's a very Aristotelian idea in terms of the moral mean. Take courage, for example, as the first on the list. what is courage? Well, intellectually we can understand what rashness is and what cowardice is, but we need to develop the moral virtue of courage, which intentionally walks between those. Take the soldier in battle, for example. The soldier in battle who self-consciously places himself in danger to save a friend. He goes out and rescues him from enemy fire and brings him back. He's being courageous. He's entered knowing what's going on, knowing the risks involved, and nonetheless doing it. Contrast that with the soldier who sees his friend in danger without a thought, just dashes out and grabs him and brings him back. Now today we'd probably call that both those people courageous. We hand out medals to both. Whereas Aristotle would suggest that the really courageous person was the one who paused and knew what the dangers were, and notwithstanding the dangers, did it. On the other hand, cowardice is failing to go out and help your friend, saying, the dangers are too great, I'm not going to risk my life out there. And this is true for everything on his list: temperance, liberality, and patience, for example, truthfulness even, which surprises many people. It's worthy of his discussion of truthfulness at this point to understand what is truth-telling always truth-telling. For example, you've probably been with somebody who's been a real buffoon. They're telling you everything about their life, and being so open and truthful is practically embarrassing. On the other hand, the people you've spoken to that you know they're not telling you the whole story. The wonderful understatement. It's an interesting discussion of truthfulness, and the list goes on. Well, that brings us to a slight digression. This is really his politics. We'll have a couple of slides on this, because I don't think we should pass beyond this discussion without mentioning something about his views and how this value theory and his ethics worked out in society. And in this sense, I think John Locke, I think, really was impacted by Aristotle's views. Again, like Plato, he begins that we're all natural social beings. But he begins with a family. He sees the family as the primary unit, and out of the family's needs for going beyond what it can produce on its own piece of land. The agrarian model, of course, is what's in his mind. And he's going to argue that the family has a needs beyond what they can produce, and so they move toward interaction with other people around them, the village. And there are things that the village and the home can't produce that the city-state has to do. For example, it's responsible to protect the village and protect the home. It's responsible to protect the freedom of the family as it operates. Of course, we have to be aware that there's an interesting concept of family for Aristotle, one which in part perhaps we would feel awkward about, to say the least. For Aristotle, the family is the husband and the wife, with the husband being very much the head, along with the pair, with the other relations, parent and child, and then the other set of relations, master and slave. And yes, he believed slaves were part of the household because they were part of the live household property. And excuse me, and he viewed slaves as having no existence even apart from the master, which is an astonishing view. We perhaps find it very hard to follow along with that. And however, Plato's view of communal property he would totally reject, particularly in relation to wives and other issues that you see in the structure of the Republic. And I don't intend to go much more into that. I think the most significant thing that you should take away here is that he has a view of him, unlike Plato, who has a very strict view of what society should look like with its three levels, the philosopher kings and queens, the guardians, and everybody else. Aristotle, on the other hand, recognized that we have multiple forms of government, some of which are good and some of which are not good, some of which he calls true or pure and some of which he calls perverted. And perhaps the list on the right-hand side is more helpful. In place of royalty, you might put monarchy. He sees royalty and monarchy as being a true form of government. There's no surprise there. His father served in the Macedonian court as physician to Philip, and he'd served both Philip and Alexander, and he was a beneficiary of Alexander the Great's patronage. It's not surprising he saw royalty as being a valid form of government. On the other hand, he could see there be a perverted form of it in terms of tyranny. Remember, he saw the function of the true government as protecting the family and protecting its property and protecting the village and their operation and the peace and tranquility. And where royalty had turned itself into tyranny, then it became perverted. He also recognised you could have aristocracy, a whole group of aristocrats leading society. And so long as they were doing the right thing by the family and the state and didn't become an oligarchy, the rich who served themselves, then he saw that as a true form of government. The most surprising view is that he saw constitutional government, a constitutional republic, as being a true form of government. And he saw democracy as being a bad form of government. Both he and Plato shared this view of democracy. There's an interesting discussion of that, and if you're doing political science, it's fun to look at their reasonings why they say democracy is bad. They're worthy, perhaps looking at our own democracy and seeing some of their criticisms of democracy and going, well, that was very bright. 2,500 years ago they saw the sort of problems we're having today because we see ourselves as a democracy and no longer a republic. Well, that's interesting of itself. Now it's time to summarise where we have been with his ethics. Never forget the importance of telos in understanding him. Be aware of his definition of happiness. It encompasses the totality of one's life. It's got to be something uniquely human and uniquely practical. And moral virtues are the regular disposition to choose correctly those things which lead to a good life. And the regular distribution is important there. And don't forget the whole discussion of the moral mean, because it's there, the moral virtues, those desire regulating characteristic which enable us to live between extremes of character. How do you do that? First and foremost, you recognise that you have to learn this. Secondly, he goes on to note that we have to keep things in balance, hence the moral mean. Everything in moderation. And then he argues that desire-regulating virtues are character traits. It's what you are. It's not an emotion, it's not a mental facility. It's what you can do. It's something you are, which is interesting, because you are a person who seeks to live this kind of life. So, virtue ethics shows how this life toward happiness is developed. You begin with understanding of happiness. You focus on the family. You realise there's an impact. That focus has an impact on the way you look at politics. And the happy life has to be lived in the context of both the family and the community. And the virtue is lived along the trajectory of the moral mean. And perhaps that will help you come to grips with those things. Now I'd like to pause for a moment and just interact with you and invite you to think with me about some of the discussions that we might see as we go along. In this course you have seen that I have tried to set out a historical development and to separate into historical sequences the development of various ethical theories so that I think you get a richer understanding of them. It's in this context that the problem for many modern materials that you'll read on virtue ethics tend to treat all virtue ethics as being virtually the same. They do have common characteristics, we acknowledge that, but my suggestion is, for various reasons, that they can be separated, and this is one of them. Modern commentators generally express appreciation for virtue ethics. It's very interesting how hard it is to say that virtue ethics is a bad thing, especially if you're a serious ethicist. After all, how can one say it's bad to be virtuous? Obviously, any system that encourages you to develop virtuous character is conceptually good. And any system that encourages a responsible approach to living has got to be good. The chief criticisms that come to virtue ethics is that most commentators want to assert that virtue ethics do not provide the practitioner of virtue ethics with an objective, clear and rational, consistent approach to living. In other words, it doesn't give you a program. It doesn't tell you how to make decisions. And that's particularly in the morally conflicted situations. In the textbook you have a discussion of William Starr and Sophie's Choice. That's a fascinating story about moral dilemma, and particularly interesting in a number of different ways, and illustrating that virtue ethics doesn't provide you with any guidance. As Sophie's faced with a choice between this child or that child, she has nothing from virtue ethics which tells her how to make that choice. And that's a criticism of virtue ethics. I'd suggest to you that there's another way of looking at that, but that's not our goal right here today. In the case of Aristotle's ethics, however, Aristotle would reject the notion, I suggest, that his ethics is intended to give you a specific plan for making decisions. The very design of his system is that it's a program of personal development, of personal moral development. And it's to be lived in the family, the community, and the state. And this is the significance of the moral mean. And in this sense, I think that he's just intentionally separating himself from the very strict deontological approach to ethics that Plato has. And so he wants to stand apart from it. And remember, if you are studying Plato and Aristotle, you'll discover that they disagree on many things. Indeed, they've set the debates of philosophy thereafter, particularly in metaphysics, in epistemology, and of course in value theory. So I think there's a very intentional distancing of himself here. And his ethics are focused for the normality of life, for the family and the community, and for living and developing a life. His ethics weren't designed to meet the contingency of confronting evil choices that confront one in war or in civil conflict. In other words, the suggestion to him that Sophie should be able to take something from the moral choices as she faces the dilemma in the concentration camp would be incomprehensible to him, because he doesn't view that as an ethical situation. Well, that's my thought for today, my thoughts on that for today. In other words, I think, like all ethicists, we have to come to there's something to be learnt here. Now remember that we are studying Aristotle's virtue ethics. There's going to be subsequent developments of this, particularly come to a head when we focus on the work of Thomas Aquinas. But at this point, let's stop and step back from our discussion of virtue ethics and remind ourselves of something important to each of you right now, and that is, what do you need to know from unit number 4? Well, here's the list of items for you. I'll leave you to read over them and go over them. Make sure that you've addressed each of them, and I hope you found this discussion interesting and helpful. And I thank you very much for watching and being involved today.